Hello and welcome back to Movie Husbands. Today we are reviewing American Fiction. Directed by Cord Jefferson and based on the 2001 novel Erasure by Percival Everett, the film follows a frustrated novelist, professor, monk, who jokingly writes an outlandish, stereotypical black book out of spite, only for the book to be published and receive widespread fame and acclaim. The film stars Jeffrey Wright, Tracee Ellis Ross, Issa Rae, Sterling K. Brown, and many more. So Jeffrey, what do you think about American Fiction?
So Cord Jefferson is a first-time filmmaker, but he's worked in a lot of TV writing for the past decade. He's worked on Watchmen, Succession, The Good Place, and Master of None, among some other things. So he's really well known in both the drama and comedy sphere, but only in a uniquely TV sphere, I would say. This is his first directorial project and one of his first solo projects that he's working on this without the camaraderie of a writing staff, so to speak. Essentially, you have two films here. You have a satire of well-meaning liberals, and then you also have a family drama about an upper middle-class black family dealing with all kinds of different things that families deal with, whether it's a mother who has dementia, death in the family, various identity issues. I found that the film's navigation of those two separate halves were mostly good, but the tonal shifts were a touch out of balance at times. Generally speaking, I think this is a very funny, very well observed conversational piece about race.
I completely agree. I do want to touch on a few things that you said, but generally I found the film to be really about society's nature to reduce people into stereotypes and how engaging these stereotypes can prevent the uplifting of nuance and a deeper understanding of each other. But what I also found so great about it was, as you just said, I thought it also weaved these themes into a personal film about family dynamics and how our own personal traits could either lead to connection or collision between family members. And also going to what you were talking about, I thought this film was downright hilarious. I thought it was one of the funniest of the year. Mm-hmm. The jokes, the satirical jokes land so heavy in both a funny way and also a realization type of way that's also a little bit dark. So there's some dark humor built into these jokes in the movie. But I thought those jokes were just extremely relevant to today's age, where we have this white power structure that for so long has dominated either government or commerce and industry. And so much of that in our day and age is being challenged and rewritten. So I think with that adjustment, you get a lot of humorous and also serious and honest reflections of the way this change is being handled. And you were alluding to some of that in what you were saying. And so I want to back up just briefly into the story of this movie, because I think that's important in understanding some of these things. We have Thelonious Monk, who is a writer, and he writes all these thought-provoking books that no one really cares about at all.
Yep.
So he decides to write this satirical book showcasing Black culture, the stereotypical version of Black culture that so many people would assume.
He basically writes like the book version of Boys in the Hood, the Johnson.
What that leads to is his book finally becoming wanted and acclaimed.
This film explores a lot of ideas that I regularly ask myself about art and about literature in general, which is, what is the responsible way of portraying Black stories? And often, and I think that this film argues in some way, is that we too neatly put them into boxes of typical Black trauma. So I think a perfect example of this is there have been only 3 Black writers who have won the Pulitzer Prize in fiction, and they are Colson Whitehead, Toni Morrison, and Alice Walker. Every single book that has won the Pulitzer Prize written by a Black author, the Pulitzer Prize in fiction written by a Black author, has been either about former or current slaves.
Oh, really?
Every single one.
Oh my gosh.
To be clear, all of those stories should be told. Now, we're not saying that those stories shouldn't be told. It's that those shouldn't be the only stories that are told. Because those types of stories get all of the acclaim and get all of the attention, it seems natural in the publishing industry, in the film industry, to want to put those up on the pedestal and say, oh, okay, we have to make a Black story. Why don't we make a story about slavery? Why don't we make a story about how difficult it is to like live in the hood? You know, all of these things. How about we make a film about the civil rights era in the 1960s? You can see how quickly these stories get pigeonholed. Denzel Washington won his first Oscar for playing a drug dealer, not for playing Macbeth. That's one side of the debate that I always have with myself, is saying it's important to tell those stories, but where are the other stories? Doesn't the Black experience contain all of these multitudes that aren't being explored? This film is in a dialogue with itself. We'll probably get to that scene later on that he has with Issa Rae towards the end of the film. But the film is really asking the question and saying, where are these other stories? Why is it so easy to get published when you're writing about slaves and so difficult to get published if you're just writing a book about an upper middle class Black family? There's a really funny bit early in the film where he goes and finds his novels in the African American studies section and wants to move them to the fiction section. And he says, what are these doing here? These are not in the study of African American culture. These are fiction. These are novels.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that was very well put, by the way. But also, it made me think of the Oscars.
Oh,
Think
yeah,
about
completely.
the films that have been nominated for Best Picture over the course of the past decades. I think up until recently, we've had a lot of changes to that, which I think American Fiction is looking like a possibility for Best Picture, which is good news. But also, we had Moonlight a few years back. Thinking back before that, you have like 12 Years a Slave. And
Driving Miss Daisy.
yeah, so there's just all these movies I can think about that really takes the Black experience and reduces it to very singular things. I think the great thing about this movie is that it's really a breaking of that monolith.
Yeah, and I don't think the film is blaming Black artists for this as much as it's wrestling with what is the idea of the canon. So like in literary culture, we always talk about the canon, Faulkner and Joyce, and 95% of the canon is white. But the 5% of it, or even lower percentage that is Black, is usually only represented by slave novels or tribal African novels. And where is the rest of it? You know, this always bothered me when I would take a Black literature or a Black voices class, it was called in high school. It felt like we were just reading that monolith that you were talking about without the varied experiences of it. It's just that we find that a lot of these books have these pre-prescribed tropes that, frankly, we'd like to see something different, you know?
And I think the family dynamic in this movie is a great example of that.
Yeah, completely.
You have Monk's character. He's this intellectual writer who is very serious and very opinionated. And then you have Monk's brother, who is played by Sterling K. Brown, and he is gay and has a lot of deeper depression issues. I mean, he recently got divorced from his wife because he's gay and he came out, but he is also a very intelligent man of his own right. He's a plastic surgeon, so he's a doctor.
He just doesn't need us to know it all the time the way that Monk does.
Yeah. It's very similar. He's very much laid back. He doesn't really care what people think of him as much. And then you have Tracee Ellis Ross' character. She plays Monk's sister. She's in the film for a little bit. Something does happen to her early in the film, which takes her out for the rest of it, unfortunately. She's also a doctor. So this is a very intelligent group of people, which I think immediately this family just breaks that monolithic trope that you would hear about Black people struggling and not getting a good education and all these things that you would just assume and that would have to be part of the Black experience in all these other movies just does not exist here.
Yeah. So what did you think of Jeffrey Wright's performance?
I thought Jeffrey Wright was such a pleasure to watch in this movie. And I mean that in terms of his acting abilities more than his character personality traits. He could be very cold and pretentious and off-putting at times, which reminded me a lot of somebody that I know.
Yeah, I was listening to an interview where they were talking about how grouchy and off-putting and difficult of a character he was, and I thought he was just right about everything. So I didn't realize that he was portrayed as grouchy, but I think him and I have a lot in common.
The entire time I was watching this movie, I was like, that is my husband right there.
And apologies because a lot of our audience knows that I'm the pretentious one, but I liked a lot of what Monk had to say, and I enjoyed a lot of his opinions.
There is a lot of truth to what he's saying. So it's not that he is unwise or lacking something. It's more that he is just so disconnected from everybody else's experiences that he's not giving the credit that maybe they deserve. I think he brilliantly encapsulated this man who is extremely intelligent and he knows the value of his work, but he struggles with the underappreciation that the world has in return for him. But the problem for him is that this appreciation that he so longingly desires from everybody around him is mirrored by his lack of attention and care to his own family members. And we see that by his connection to them. He doesn't really call his brother at all. He rarely sees his sister, who basically takes care of their mother alone. This ends up being a big theme of the movie. His own appreciation for other people somehow returns the appreciation for him.
Which is funny, because that's something I also struggle with.
Exactly.
I thought his performance was terrific. It's a very lived-in performance. I suspect he'll be nominated for Best Actor at the Oscars, but I think something that may be a hurdle to him winning is this is such a subtle lived-in performance that I don't think they typically award those. I'm not saying it's not deserving, but we're probably going to get performance that's much more loud. I wish that we were able to honor these performances a bit more, just because they're subtle and lived in, and just because that character feels like an authentic person is actually a big attribute, even though there's not an Oscar scene.
Yeah, and also to add to that, the majority of the deadpan humor in this movie relies on his delivery, which I thought was just impeccable.
When he has to become a different person because of this authorship is some of the funniest things I've ever seen. All of the siblings portray this intimacy that siblings have with one another. Even it seems like they don't speak a lot, there's just this natural shared language and experience that you just easily slip into whenever you're with your siblings. I thought all three of them showed that quite beautifully. Sterling K. Brown in particular, he's able to deliver this witty dialogue and have this dry sense of humor that fits in really well with the film, but those scenes are done quite as deftly as some of the more emotional scenes in this movie. And frankly, a lot of the emotional scenes fall on Sterling K. Brown's shoulders. He's kind of the heart of the film in a way.
Definitely, because his readiness to be emotionally open and available and honest about himself in front of other people, regardless of what they think, competes completely with Jeffrey Wright's character, who is very much reserved and in his own feelings and not really being expressive about them. All right, so from here, I think we're getting deeper aspects of the movie. That includes specific jokes, which we'll talk about, the ending, and we'll have specific analysis of that. So if you haven't seen American Fiction yet, I recommend coming back after you've seen the movie. I do want to talk about some of the more hilarious moments of the film. Some of the best moments with regards to that, I think, comes down to one of the things you were talking about earlier, which was Jeffrey Wright's character having to change characters into this other person that he is becoming as the ghostwriter for this novel.
They'll take a Chenin Blanc. That's a great joke.
That was one of the best jokes.
Because I really thought that he would order a Hennessy or something just to be in character, quote unquote. And he's like, no, Chenin Blanc.
So he basically has to play this convict that is out of jail, that escaped jail.
I can't imagine how hard this was to act too, because he has to be in character as Monk, who is so uncomfortable that he has to do this at all. So you see his physical discomfort as he's relaying all of these hilarious lines and hilarious aptitudes.
In his body motion and movement, he becomes more like strong and like manly and burly. Yeah. I think also another great aspect of the movie is his relationship with Issa Rae's character, Centaura, because she has written a book that gets a lot of acclaim, and he's only read excerpts from this book, but he assumes it's one of these books that is just very stereotypical of the Black experience, that doesn't have anything illuminating about it at all. And it really is a case of judging a book by its cover, because she ends up being somebody who thought more about this book than was led on by these excerpts. But with regards to their relationship, they end up becoming judges for a literary panel that is picking out the literary award for the year of best novel. Monk's book ends up being part of this contemplation. You have this panel of 3 white people and 2 Black people. And so this most hilarious moment at the top of this heated debate about who's going to win, when the 3 white judges decide that it's going to be Monk's book, and the 2 Black judges say, we do not want this book to win. They say, well, we have the votes and we won. And then the woman says, well, I think it's best that we just really uplift Black voices at this time, which was just so hilarious considering the 2 of them are sitting right there in the room.
That joke actually took a second for me, but once I realized it was really funny. I think my favorite joke in the movie is a background joke, actually, and it's when they're talking to the white publisher, who her heart is in the right place. She's trying to uplift Black voices, but she's only doing it in ways that make money. They show a wide of her office, and she has 2 RBG posters.
Yes. Oh my God, it was so good.
Absolutely perfect. Like, we all know people like that. Maybe I'm a person like that. I don't know. But I just thought that was so funny and such a uniquely funny characterization.
We do have an ornament on a Christmas tree of her being Descent. Discussing that as well, the publisher that wants to buy the book, they are having this phone call conversation where, of course, Jeffrey Wright is pretending in this alter character. He decides for and giggles to change the name of the novel, and they have this moment where they're like, no, we can't call it that. But then they go off the line for a second, they come back and they're like, okay, we will. But it's like the pressure,
it's so raw, it's so real,
right? The way they just like grandize him in that moment is very illuminating, very funny, because it's very true. I do also briefly want to mention Raymond Anthony Thomas and Myra Lucretia Taylor as Lorraine and Maynard. They have little minor roles in the movie, but I thought there was so much heart that was brought into the movie by these 2 people. They end up becoming this random couple that gets married during the movie. And I absolutely just adored these scenes because I thought they were just cute and funny, brought this simplistic form about human relationships down to earth. And I thought that was something the movie really needed. I do also want to talk briefly about the cinematography in this movie. The cinematographer is Christina Dunlap. She most recently worked as a cinematographer on last year's Cha-Cha Real Smooth, which I thought was an interesting fact. Some of my favorite visual moments happened in this movie of the year, which I want to discuss. One, just Jeffrey Wright, he's just standing out on a concrete slab overlooking the water in reflection. I thought it was a beautiful portrait moment, and there was a lot of those filled in the movie, just these little portrait moments. I also loved this one shot during the wedding where the camera is slowly moving backwards on the porch, and it's revealing people dancing on the porch. And you first just get Lorraine and Maynard just dancing, and then it reveals more people dancing. And there's this hilarious moment right at the end of that shot where you see the mom dancing with the 2 gay boys. But that long tracking shot was just so brilliant because it just brought everybody's personalities out as it moved backwards. I also really enjoyed the lighting in this movie because I thought it was extremely well balanced. It had very minimal shadows. I think it led to the movie feeling quite positive and optimistic. I got the impression that it was quite hopeful about society society's overall direction while also remaining very realistic about the challenges still being faced. So I thought it was a very much a compliment to the narrative and the themes of the movie.
So this film does an interesting thing towards the end where essentially we're brought into a pitch that Monk is giving to this producer played by Adam Brody, who came into the film kind of late. And he talks about these different ways in which this story that has happened to him in this film could become a movie and have these different endings. So the first one is a cut to black, and essentially the film tricks you into thinking that's the ending. You're kind of like, oh. But then it comes back and he's just pitching the movie. And then there's another one where I can't remember the woman he's dating's name, but he basically runs to her house and apologizes to her.
Yes. But it still cuts to black before she opens the door.
Yes. And then the third one is when he is shot dead by the police because they think the award is a gun. I thought maybe your mileage may vary on this one. I thought it was pretty clever, but I can understand maybe a typical mass audience going to see this and saying, that was a little weird and cheap.
I personally really enjoyed it because I assumed that first cut to black was the exact ending of the movie.
Yeah.
And I thought the rest was just a little bit of added satire. I love how when it comes back from that moment, he's talking about how it's ambiguous and it leads you to a conversation. And that's how movies should be ending. And that's one of our favorite ways movies end is when they just cut to black and you're left to just think about what actually happened next. I love this because he's having this conversation with this director currently making a movie called Plantation Annihilation.
Yeah, which I think is making fun of the movie Antebellum.
What's so hilarious about that is that he wants this moment, he wants the movie to end on some kind of dramatic moment.
Yeah.
So Jeffrey Wright keeps changing it to make it more dramatic and more sensational until the point where the director finally agrees with him. So it's like, well, I'm getting the movie done and maybe I can move forward, which I thought was actually interesting because maybe that's some of what the author of the book felt, because you had told me earlier that the author of the book was contacted multiple times in the past about adapting this into a film, and he always said no.
Yeah.
Until he spoke with Cord Jefferson. So I don't know if the end is almost a reflection of his own experience in that way. Maybe that's an ode to that.
Yeah, maybe. I haven't read the book. From just what Cord Jefferson was saying, it seems like the book was quite a bit darker. It was written in 2001, so Cord Jefferson had to update a lot of the jokes, a lot of the humor, and a lot of the context of these jokes, but he kept a lot of the framework of the original book from 2001. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting. It sounds like the author in his personality has quite a bit in common with Monk, that he's kind of a grumpy guy and that he really prizes high literature and things like that.
I think it really nailed it though with that final shot that shows the extra who is dressed as a slave for the movie.
Yep.
And they get in the car and drive off, but he gives him a little nod. So I think it's an understanding of I see you.
Yep.
It's an ability to see that change is slowly happening, but change takes time. It's also a joke about how nothing's changed at all. So
So you ready to go to grades?
I'm ready to go to grades. I give American Fiction an A. I really love this movie. I thought it was hilarious. I thought it was insightful. You know, I couldn't really help but thinking about when we all did those black boxes on Instagram for Blackout Tuesday. In all reality, that was started out by two black women, but that was sort of co-opted by the white people.
Yeah.
It made me really think about how a lot of white people, that conversation almost started and ended with that black box, as if that one action alone was enough to absolve them of their guilt with related to George Floyd at the time. I think this movie brilliantly highlighted that mediocre actions many white people take to pretend they're really doing something to help promote racial equality, whether it's putting a few black people on a judging panel to feign influence, or publishing houses selecting only books that fit a stereotypical, sensationalized idea that they have about black lives to feign uplifting black voices. And I just think this movie perfectly encapsulated what that is like. And I don't think I've seen a movie that's really done that to the extent that this movie has, while all doing so many other things, you know, showing family dynamics that were very sweet. It really had so much thematically packed into it. And I think it did a wonderful job of balancing this. One thing I didn't mention was the score. I really enjoyed the score because there were different scores for different parts of the movie. So when you had these intimate family moments that are more personal, there was a familiar theme in the score. It played the same way every single time. It was like a jazzy piano that played.
Yep.
And I knew that something sentimental was coming up. So once that music started, I knew what to expect from that scene.
I give the film an A-. I think it's really great. There's a scene in particular, and I can't remember exactly what precedes it, but I remember feeling like a scene was jovial and funny and just all generally enjoyable. And that leads into a scene where the mother gets lost and they find her on the beach. And I remember actually that the score in that scene kind of bothered me because it went from a playfulness to a melancholy too fast. And then I felt like it was playing with my emotions too much without earning it to get there. And also, I thought that the death of his sister was a little random, to be honest. I thought that was treated kind of strangely, almost more like a plot device than something that was important to the story. It didn't bother me hugely, and those are two very small parts of the film, but in both of those scenes, I felt a little taken out of it. Aside from that, I think this is one of the sharpest satires about race in a very, very long time, maybe since like early seasons of Dear White People. It's certainly the funniest movie I saw this year. I couldn't stop laughing.
All right, and that's it for our review of American Fiction. American Fiction is now in theaters and expanding over the next couple of weeks, so if you haven't seen it, go check it out. Let us know in the comments, what did you think about American Fiction? As always, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.